Good morning, friends. I will take the liberty of muting us by way of welcoming. Welcome, shut up. Sorry. So that we can offer a bracha, a blessing for the study of Torah together as a community from our own homes. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I'm so happy that we have this time together in this next dreary day in a sequence of dreary days. So I hope that you're warm and comfy wherever you are and that you're looking forward to continuing where we left off. It was not my original syllabus, but seeing as I did not distribute a syllabus, which was intentional because I wanted to have the flexibility to kind of respond to the flow of the class, which I think is consistent with what Talmud study itself demands, which is that I'd rather go deep than broad. Particularly for this introduction to Talmud class, the nature of Talmud is to go deep. And so to do some kind of cursory survey where you look at a line here or a line there and say, oh, what amazing nuggets of wisdom the rabbis dispense and nothing more, you're not really studying Talmud. Studying Talmud as a handful of selected best hits quotes is not really the way in which we encounter what Talmud is, neither its depth nor its strangeness. Strangeness, of course, to us as 21st century American, modern, mostly Jewish readers who are accustomed to different norms informing what text is and how we understand text. Talmud actually requires of the reader a very different kind of reading. And a willingness to go down all sorts of digressions that in any other prose or poetry would be considered unwanted. In Talmud, that actually is the essence. Responding to a question that was asked before we began the recording this morning, there are two Talmuds that were generated by two different rabbinic communities of antiquity, both at approximately the same time, but in two different geographical regions. The Talmud that was produced by the rabbis who remained after the real diaspora of the Jewish people, which is usually linked to the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 Common Era, is really the start of when Jews en masse entered the dispersion into the Mediterranean rim, the Greco-Roman world, more fully than they had before, though we know that exile was not an unfamiliar condition even to the biblical Israelite people, and in fact is very much the stuff of any biblical narrative, which is going to take us to Babylonia in a moment. But for the Jews who remain behind, for the rabbis who remain behind in Eretz Yisrael, concentrated mostly around the area of the Galilee, a project of inquiry into the Mishnah and commentary on the Mishnah, which would become the so-called Jerusalem Talmud or Palestinian Talmud, Jerusalem having nothing to do with where it was actually produced, but simply the honorific that was given to it by the rabbis, almost as a stand-in for the Jerusalem of brick and stone that Jews after Bar Kokhba were restricted from entering. That city had been renamed by the Romans Ilia Capitolina, and with a shrine to Jupiter at its peak, and Jews were verboten. And I think in some ways, perhaps the name Yerushalmi or the Jerusalem Talmud was a way of honoring the place of Jerusalem in Jewish memory, if not in Jewish actual practice in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries and onward. There always did remain behind in Eretz Yisrael a remnant of Jews. And so the so-called Jerusalem Talmud or the Yerushalmi, also called the Palestinian Talmud, again, having nothing to do with today's Palestinians, but rather simply the name of the Talmud whose provenance was Palestine or Palestina, the name of the Roman province that the Romans gave to the territory after the conquest of Judah and after the fall of Bar Kokhba. I prefer actually the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, though nobody actually calls it that. But you can think of it that way. That's the best way of describing it, the Talmud that was produced in the land of Israel. The second Talmud, the other Talmud, not second chronologically, just second in the order that I'm describing it, was produced by the exiled Jewish rabbis and Jews of Babylonia. It is known as the Bavli. Two great academies arose in Babylonia, what is modern-day Iraq, first in Sura and then in Pumbedita, and these would become the chief centers of Jewish learning in the world at the time. So we're talking, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries and onward. There had been an exilic Jewish community living in Babylonia since the time of the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE. And so a remnant of Jews remained behind in Babylonia from biblical times. And it is that community that grew, especially after the dispersion, after Bar Kokhba, to include many prominent teachers who go by the Aramaic honorific title Rav, as opposed to the rabbis who remain behind in Eretz Yisrael, who go by the honorific title Rabbi or Rabbi, but it means the same thing, a great teacher. And the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud produce the work that is synonymous with Talmud itself. So anyone who says, I studied Talmud this morning, or I studied Gemara with my rabbi, or I learned Gemara would be the way that, if you really want to talk like you are on the inside of this conversation, you'd go to all your friends over lunch today, and when they ask you, what did you do? Don't say I studied Talmud. I say I learned Gemara. I learned my Gemara with my rabbi and my community. Without any further adjectives attached to it, learning Gemara, studying Talmud always means Babylonian Talmud. In just common Jewish colloquial parlance, Talmud means Babylonian Talmud. It is the much more expansive of the Talmuds. It is the much more detailed of the Talmuds, and it is the much more carefully redacted and uniform in language and tone. The Palestinian Talmud is generally viewed as being almost sort of like an unfinished symphony. It's a little bit raggedy around the edges. It appears to be more of a patchwork quilt. And the Babylonian Talmud appears to have been gone over much more assiduously by later generations of redactors known as the Savoraim, the last 200 years of Talmudic development, say from the years 500 plus minus to 700 plus minus of the Common Era. I'm going to just respond to Steve's question in the chat. The Mishnaic rabbis, remember the Mishnah compiles teachings from the rabbis and a group of scholars or Jewish leaders that I sometimes refer to, though this is not a term you'll see written in books, as the proto-rabbis. They seem to be the offshoots or close descendants of the Pharisees, the Perushim, a class of Jewish intellects and leaders living before, during, and after the time of Jesus, not so much after, who believe that the oral law holds sway, namely that the rich interpretive traditions of the Jewish people have a certain authority over Jewish life and practice. That in contrast to other groups who were much more, I would say, lowercase c conservative in their view of the development of Jewish law and its fixity. So the Mishnaic rabbis officially, as a class of Jewish scholars, convene around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem at the fall of the first Judean revolt in the year 70, 71, 72, 73, 74 of the Common Era. No surprise, a parallel project by the early Christian community is also underway at the same time, which is the writing of the Gospels. The 4 books plus the book of Acts that will constitute the core of the narrative portion of the Christian scriptures, or what our Christian friends call their New Testament. In the Jewish communities, rabbis began to assemble first in the seaside town of Yavne, which is south of what is today Tel Aviv, and later would coalesce around the Galilee. And so it was largely a community of rabbis and disciples learning together, writing, practicing in the northern and northeastern portion of what is Eretz Yisrael. Michelle, would you like to, I don't see you, but I see your digital hand up, so maybe you want to chime in.
Yeah, thank you. So do we have evidence of, or was there like Responsea or conversation between these two communities?
Yes, we do. The Talmud actually talks at some length about rabbis traveling from the Babylonian community to the community of rabbis in Eretz Yisrael. And there is evidence of cross-pollination between the two Talmuds in passages that are strikingly similar or even identical. So there's both folkloric and what appear to be textual evidences of literary sharing, and certainly of figures who were known to both the Palestinian Jewish community and the Babylonian Jewish communities. And only because I'm a little bit under-caffeinated today, the names of the most famous rabbi who was a kind of traveler from either Palestine to Babylonia or vice versa is eluding me, but I'll find it, if not today, then before our next class next week. Okay, Norm, you want to ask any other questions before we dive into our passage? Just unmute yourself kindly, please. Still muted. So sorry. I see you talking, but your mic is on. Your mic is off, rather.
Any difference in subject matter or content between the two communities?
Yeah, for sure. You know, if you actually, this would be better show than tell. So what I'm doing right now is, again, I can't say enough about Safaria. I know you hear me geek out to this online tool, but it's more than that. I was thinking about this just this morning as I was sort of like just getting ready for today's class. I was thinking about how Safaria revolutionizes Jewish learning and what my rabbinical school experience, my seminary experience would have been like if we had Safaria then. It would have been radically different. I mean, the only way to approach Safaria would approach Jewish text was by picking up a book. And there is something to be said. I've spent the last several years collecting a gorgeous edition of the Babylonian Talmud, which is in my office, Hebrew, English, and I love using the book. When I'm in my office, I do use the book. But Safaria is every day proliferating the amount of sources and the translations and the commentary on those sources. So it is becoming, I think, the definitive wellspring of Jewish textual tradition. It is absolutely astonishing how much and how high quality Safaria has become. And the way in which the tools allow the reader or the student to really dive into the text in a way that makes very unapproachable work somewhat approachable for the layperson, not just for it's an incredible tool for scholars and rabbis and cantors and people who are familiar with the text, but it is an incredible tool for the interested layperson. Okay, so when you go to the homepage of Safaria, it immediately calls up its texts menu, and if you click on Talmud, you see here at the top, I'm going to try and enlarge it so you can see it. You have two choices. It defaults to Babylonian, but you can also click here for Jerusalem. So when you do that, here, this might help. The Babylonian Talmud proceeds according to the orders of the Mishnah. As we said last week and reminded ourselves from the Seder song, Echad mi yodea, who knows one, I know one. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah, 6. The orders of the Mishnah are Zeraim, meaning agriculture, of which only one of the original Mishnaic tractates goes under Talmudic consideration. In other words, if you go back a page, go back a page to the text page and click Mishnah. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. There's Zeraim, which includes all of these texts. Brachot, which we've studied together. Some of you in this room have studied Brachot with your classmates and with me a couple of years ago. Most of this would be unfamiliar because they relate to biblical agricultural practices that really would feel remote and foreign from our contemporary Jewish lives, though something like challah, there's a word you know, doughs separated when baking bread and given to priests. Moed, which means holidays, a lot of stuff there. We're looking today at Eiruvin, enclosures that legally expand the areas in which one can carry and travel on Shabbat. But you know, some of these words should be more familiar, like Pesachim, the tractate all about Passover. Yoma, which is Yom Kippur. Yoma meaning the day. In Mishnaic parlance, if you say the day, Yoma, you mean the big day, Yom Kippur. Sukkah, Megillah, which is about Esther. No surprise there. Nashim, which literally means women or family law. And these are the passages. Ketubot might be the most familiar word there, meaning marriage contracts, the ketubah. Nizikin, damages. We've looked our first class at Bava Metzia. That was the passage about Eliezer versus the academy. Sanhedrin, that might be a familiar word, the judicial system, the ancient rabbinical court. Pirkei Avot falls under that tractate. Kodashim, which means sacrificial offerings, holy things, and Toharot, which means purity. And then there are a few other, these are Mishnaic era other texts. It just goes on and on and on and on, and commentaries. So the acronym for the Mishnah that every rabbi in training learns to remember the orders of the Mishnah is Zaman Nakat. Zaman Nakat. Zayin Mem Nun, Nun Kuf Tet. Zraim, Moed, Nashim. Sorry, I already blew it. Zaman, Nashim, Nizikin, Kodashim, Tohorot. So you're just remembering the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Then when you go to the Talmud, you can see that the Babylonian Talmud follows the order, but it doesn't take up every single tractate. So under Zeraim, it only has a tractate on Brachot, but it has tractates on all of the Mishnaic, has commentary on all of the Mishnaic tractates under Moed, holidays, many under Nashim, but not all, many but not all under Nizikin, and all under Kodashim, and then only one under Toharot, which is tractate Nida, which is about menstruation and ritual impurity conferred by menstruation. And then there are these other extra Talmudic tractates which are contemporaneous with the writing of the Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, by contrast, has a very extensive set of commentaries on agriculture. Similarly, a lot on holidays, fewer on family law, about the same on Nizikin, and also only Nida. So it seems like there seems to be a similar project, but the big difference is that the Jerusalem Talmud actually has a lot more to say about biblical agriculture. And that makes perfect sense because all of the rules of biblical agriculture pertain almost only in the land of Israel. Right? Following? So that makes sense that the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael would take up considerations of biblical agriculture in ways that the Babylonian Talmud seems utterly disinterested in. And that's largely because the the community of Jews that remained behind in Eretz Yisrael was likely to have been more connected to the land and more agrarian than the Jews of Babylonia, who were residents and more urbanized. So anyway, there's an answer for you. It's certainly not comprehensive, but it gets you a part of the way there. Okay, so we are going to go, so I can keep this screen on. I can click Babylonian Talmud, Eiruvin, 13b, which is where we left off last week. So we were toward the end of 13b, and we started racing through the best part. So we're going to go back to the key elements, and then we're just going to keep moving forward and forward and forward today. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. So Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel, and we know that we're in the Gemara, the later or the secondary stratum of Talmudic discourse, because of the verb Amar, which is deployed to describe the kind of discussion, Amar being a word meaning to speak or say, but particularly in the Gemara, this indicates that we're outside the layer of Mishnah, chronologically speaking. The words that introduce a Mishnaic or Mishnaic era passage are usually related to the root Tana, which means the ancient reciters would say. They both mean to say, but they both have very different connotations. So Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel, Shalosh Shanim, for 3 years, Shalosh Shanim, see, not hard, Nechleku Beit Shammai Ubeit Hillel. Literally, Nechleku from the Hebrew root chelek, which means to apportion or to cut something up into pieces. If you are out to dinner in a nice restaurant in Tel Aviv, as I intend to be in a month with my CCAR colleagues, and you want to share dessert, you use this word. You say, Efshar lachlok oto. Is it possible to literally to cut it up, or to make a slice of it? But it is also the word that is used to apportion or share in the sense of sharing a meal. In this case, though, it means something very different. It means they were divided, right? They were divided on a particular issue. Chelek, to cut. So they were on two different sides of a cut or a seam. Beit Shammai Ubeit Hillel, the house of Shammai, meaning the academy, the yeshiva of the figure Shammai and this figure Hillel. Halalu Omrim, this is what they said. Halacha k'motenu, the law goes according to us. Halacha k'motenu. The halacha is like our point of view. The halalu omrim, while the others would say, halacha k'motenu. No, the halacha is according to our way. This part of the reading is not too hard. Yatza'a bat kol ve'amra, a bat kol, that's a term we learned 2 weeks ago. A heavenly voice went forward and declared and said, Amra, there's that root again, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein. Both these and those, Elu va'elu, both these and those, divrei Elohim chayim hein, are the words, divrei from davar, of the living God. Now this is a Talmudic nugget that's on the lips of anyone who's studied Talmud. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein, often selectively quoted to one's own detriment of learning and understanding. If you quote only these 5 words, Elu va'elu divrei, or 6 words, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein, you miss the next part, which is v'halacha, Elu va'elu, these and those are both the words of the living God. V'halacha, but the law, the halacha, the Jewish law, k'Beit Hillel, follows Beit Hillel. Right, you can see it in the English. This was a great representative passage to break our teeth on the Hebrew. I'm not going to retranslate it, but you have to get that last part, because if both the Academy of Shammai and Hillel are determined to be equally declaring the words of the living God, whatever that may mean, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, it is a meaningless statement so far as Jewish practice and understanding is concerned without the final clause, v'halacha k'Beit Hillel. But the halacha still follows Beit Hillel. Because at the end of the day, you can't have a Jewish practice that consists of both X and not X being equally valid. Famous debate between Beit Hillel and Shammai, which we might get to in a couple weeks. How to light a Hanukkah menorah. That's in Tractate Shabbat. Why? Because there is no Tractate Hanukkah, and Tractate Shabbat does talk about lighting candles on the Sabbath. So why not digress and talk about lighting candles on the festival of Hanukkah? Where else are you going to put it in the Talmud? So Beit Shammai says you start with 8 on night 1 of the festival and you reduce. Beit Hillel says you start with 1 and you increase. Well, you can't end the conversation. I mean, you could, the Talmud often does, but that is highly unsatisfactory from the perspective of what is the halacha? You can't have Jews willy-nilly choosing, I'll just put as many candles in as I think I want. I'll follow Beit Hillel while half the Jewish world follows Beit Shammai. Some things have to be unified among the Jewish people, even if the old saw about 2 Jews, 3 opinions is universally true at all times and places for our people. You can't have people starting with 8 Hanukkah candles on night 1 and other people starting with 1 and just doing their own thing and meeting. I guess on night 4, everybody would be correct. But follow? Okay, so the halacha goes according to Beit Hillel. Does anyone just want to comment? And because we covered this last week, maybe you had some reflection time, or maybe you just slept on this and an insight emerged into Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein. Both these and those are the words of the living God, v'halacha k'Beit Hillel, while the halacha, nevertheless, follows Beit Hillel. Steve Maskett first, and then we'll hear from my folks.
No, my sense is that it's the debate itself that is lifted up as part of the words of the living God, or so that all the process is all important.
Thank you. Yes, the process, the dialogue, the discussion, the act of reasoning itself is holy. Perhaps so much so that the halacha, though essential, as I've said, is subsidiary to the process. Lovely insight. Mom and Dad, your mic is now off. Great.
If the citation is both these and these are the words of the living God, I think the lesson that we learned last week was the manner in which the words are delivered makes ultimate difference here.
Right.
And with that, we learned that Hillel had the upper hand in how he delivered the word.
That's right. And the spiritual and emotional truth of what the next passage comes to convey, I think, is among the most important lessons that Jewish learners can internalize, which is that in Jewish learning, the strength of your reasoning in making a halachic argument, in arguing, and arguing is, part of Judaism, an essential part of Judaism, but you can argue fair or you can argue foul. And how we communicate our reasoning, how we treat our colleagues, very important that we see even those with diametrically opposed opinions as colleagues, says a lot about what the Jewish tradition ultimately values. Lovely. And so I think that's the segue we needed to approach the next passage. These paragraph breaks, of course, don't exist in the Talmud, but they're helpfully provided by this translation and by Safaria, so much so that they've even assigned a little numeral. So we're going to paragraph 11. That's, I think, a standard enumeration system, so that if you're studying Talmud in any number of different contexts and communities, you can say, we're in paragraph 11 on 13b of Tractate Eiruvin. Okay. Remind yourselves as well what we talked about last week, which is that we're very far from the initial discourse, which is nominally this tractate about Sabbath boundaries. Doesn't have to do with that, but that's, that is the way of the Talmud, that it's just a door. Sabbath boundaries is a conversational door to many other and much deeper considerations. Okay, so we're going to move on to the reasoning that my dad recalled correctly from last week. The Gemara asks, anything in plain type means it's not actually there, but it is implied. Anything in bold type is the actual translation of the actual text. Since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halacha established in accordance with their opinion? The reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, meaning showing restraint when affronted, and when they taught the halacha, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. So they actually gave the kavod, the honor of quoting with respect their opponent's views, even before their own, as if to suggest that their opponent's views had validity. Moreover, when they formulated their own teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized this. That's what I was just saying. Prioritized the statements of Beit Shammai over their own statements in deference to Beit Shammai. This is exactly what Congress is not doing, right? But it's not just Congress. Congress is, these are our elected officials. They are the people we voted into office. And therefore, Congress is just, our leaders are just an avatar for the American people. And I think that as a country, possibly as a civilization, as a world, we have completely lost the ability to do what is extolled, what is viewed as an essential mode of discourse, the ability to quote your opponent with respect and deference before presenting an opposing view. Not to obliterate or humiliate another, but rather to regard the other with appropriate respect. And then to make a case, by the way, that was also needed to be meritorious on its own logical merits. Like deference and respect is nice, but it won't excuse a shoddy or a faulty argument. But if both arguments are equally sound from the standpoint of logic, and truth be told, reducing 8 candles to 1 on Hanukkah, which is a great example, by the way, or increasing from 1 to 8, both have logical merit. If you know the reasoning, Shammai says, look, the Maccabees found a single cruse of oil, right? So they had as much fuel as they were ever going to have for lighting the Hanukiya, not the Hanukkah, it wasn't a Hanukiya, it was a menorah. It was the 7-branched candelabrum in the ancient temple that the Seleucid Greeks had desecrated. They had as much oil as they were going to ever have when they found it on night 1 of what would become the festival, right? Following my reasoning here. And therefore the fuel decreased every night. So the light actually, they lit all 7 branches on the first night, it being a 7-branch menorah like the one we have at WRT, the glass sculpture menorah. As you face the bima, it's on the right-hand side. I call it the Superman Fortress of Solitude menorah, because it looks like never mind. If you know my reference, then you get my reference. And now it's on YouTube for posterity. If you're looking at that menorah, it's 7 branches, right? So they had as much fuel as they're ever going to have on night 1. It went down, it went down, it went down, it went down. On the last night, it fizzled out, no more light. That's Shammai's argument. Hillel says, with all due respect to my esteemed colleagues who argue X, the proper way to light your Hanukiya is you start with 1 candle on night 1 and you go to night 8. But he has to provide a Jewish reason why, right? Not just because it's nice. He says, because in matters of holiness, we should always increase and never diminish. In other words, the light is symbolic of bringing Kedusha, of holiness, into the world. And therefore, the message we want to send needs to be greater, 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 greater. You could have a great debate about this. You know, in some ways, the logic of Shammai is unimpeachable, but the message of Hillel prevails. But if you have equally sound logical arguments, then the only thing that can cause one to prevail over the other, and not just in this one instance, but consistently, the Halacha follows Beit Hillel. The Talmud wants to teach here that it was about the way in which they argued. Judy Gross.
There's a teaching technique in discussion where you ask the person who wants to contribute an opinion to repeat what has been said before. So you're acknowledging what the one said that you're going to be arguing against, or on a different principle of whatever you're talking about, but you're respecting the person first, and then you're giving your opinion. And in doing so, in a way, you have to clarify, what is that person really saying? And making sure you understand what that person is saying before you can give your side of the debate.
It is part of a discipline of human relations, and both psychotherapy, social work, anyone who works in a counseling profession is trained early and assiduously in the discipline of active listening. You actually say the thing you just heard so that the person with whom you are in dialogue or even dispute recognizes that you have heard and understood. And by the way, it includes the opportunity for the first partner in the dyad to say, no, that's not what I meant or not what I said. This is also, by the way, the core of couples therapy work. And this equally applies in, for instance, the rabbi-congregant counseling relationship, the psychotherapist-patient counseling relationship, the social worker-client counseling relationship, and in any other dyad between friends who are having a dispute, between lovers or partners or spouses who are having a disagreement. Active listening is an essential tool in getting to a more harmonious outcome, even if at the end of the day, you got to go one way instead of the other. A couple comes to me recently and says, we weren't trying to get pregnant, and we did, and we don't know what to do. And we're on two different pages because our first pregnancy was or our second, they already had two. Our second pregnancy was so agonizing that we're not sure we want to go through it again, but we're on two different pages. One of us wants to go through with it and one does not. Rabbi, help us. Begin with active listening, right? Because often disputes are exacerbated by one talking past the other and not really understanding what the other is saying. So Hillel and Shammai should be held up as exemplars of active listening. Steve Maskett. At the end of the day, by the way, what I wanted to say is you can't both carry the child to term and not carry the child to term. Like the Halacha kaved Hillel. There are some things in life that cannot be both and. There has to be an either or. But how do you get to that, right? How do you get to who will move the decision forward in Judaism as in life?
Solomonic, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But cutting an actual baby in two is rarely an advisable strategy.
But that led to something else. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. Steve, did you want to chime in?
So I do understand this passage to be referring to the method of discourse that Hillel used versus Shammai, but I'm wondering whether the words about forbearance, etc., which may sort of allude also to the difference between the positions they ended up taking, which is in the simplistic fashion that Hillel was always finding ways to make it easier to be compliant, and Shammai being more conservative and not. Because that's where I was seeing that word forbearance somehow alluding to that as well. But
yeah, no, I appreciate that. I actually meant to go back into the Hebrew and look at the word. So the word for agreeable is a very important word. I'm glad that we're flagging this. I had not noticed this until now, but I needed this for where we're going to head today. The Hebrew word is nochin. I'll show you it on screen. It's this word here, shenochin. She is a prefix, so don't get hung up. Usually, if you want to know where the meaning of a Hebrew word resides, it's on the inside of the word. It's the root, this root. 3 letters, nun, vav, chet. Noach. Those of you who know the name Noach, which is Noah, know that it is a word that means comfort or ease. In fact, in like a colonial America, comfort was a gentleman's name, right? I don't know if I forget. There was like a famous preacher, Comfort something or other. It's kind of out of vogue these days.
It comes up in the movie National Treasure too.
All right, great. Yeah, I mean, maybe post-millennials will start naming their kids Comfort and all of these like, strange ancient names, but Noach, it's Noah. Shenochim, they were, literally it says agreeable. They were comfortable. They presented with ease. And this word here, aluvin, aluv, is a word that literally means wretched or debased. But it means it's the opposite of to aggrandize, right? To be self-effacing. So they were easygoing, and self-effacing, I think would be very good idiomatic English translations of these two words. Why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the Halacha follow their opinion? Mipnei shenochin va'aluvin hayu. Because they were easygoing, they were agreeable, and self-effacing, not arrogating themselves over their partner. Okay, so that gives us enough to move on from here and proceed through the text sequentially. Now we're going to have an actual case study. This is sometimes called a ma'aseh. Ma'aseh from the Hebrew root asa or osei, which means to make or to do. It is equivalent to the French word faire, F-A-I-R-E, right? Faire, to make or to do. In most Romance languages, make and do mean the same thing. Hebrew as well. La'asot. That's probably a word you've heard if you have any like shul Hebrew in your data bank up here. Osei shalom bimromav is the most famous use of osei that all of us know. All of us knows? Yeah, all of us knows. Each of us knows. Osei shalom bimromav. May the one who makes peace in the highest heights. Hu ya'aseh shalom. May God also make peace. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, on us and on all of Israel. V'imru amen, and let's say amen. That's the text at the end of the Kaddish that becomes the famous song. Osei. Okay, so this is a ma'aseh, which is the noun form of osei. Osei, to make or to do. Ma'aseh, a doing. We're going to learn by way of a real example. It is also the same word that gives us in Yiddish pronunciation, Misa. A Misa is a ma'aseh. So a Baba Misa literally means something that happened to grandma. Baba Misa. I'm going to give you a real story of something that happened to grandma, and that will be what will educate you in this situation. It is usually used as a pejorative. That's just a Baba Misa. Don't follow that tradition, that practice, that teaching, because it has no real authority. It's just a thing that grandma did. Baba Misa, from Ma'aseh, from La'asot. Cool, right? Okay, here we go. I think it's cool. You probably have spent the last 3 minutes going, get on with it, Blake. Here we go. Okay. As in the Mishnah that we learned, in the case of one, so here they're going to cite a previous Mishnah, which functions as a ma'aseh, a deed, a thing that happened by way of substantiating the previous point. You have to hold in your head, what is the previous point? This is going to teach why the halacha follows Hillel and not Shammai. The reason is because they were nochin va'aluvin. They were agreeable and self-effacing. Let's see what happens. As in the Mishnah that we learned, in the case of one whose head and most of his body were in a sukkah, but his table was in the house. Now this requires that the reader knows a lot about Jewish practice already, as is the way of Talmud. It assumes a high degree of familiarity with basic Jewish practice. Why would you have, what is a sukkah? The Talmud here does not want to explain that. It assumes that you know. It also assumes that you know why you have a meal set out. Because in order to fulfill the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah, you have to do something that Judaism considers to be an act of dwelling. Those two things are sleeping and, more importantly, eating. So if you have a meal in a sukkah, you have definitively fulfilled the mitzvah of leshev basukkah, of dwelling in a sukkah. That's why we always have tables in sukkahs or food. You eat in a sukkah, then you can say, I was in a sukkah. It's very Jewish. How do you know you were somewhere? You had a meal. Okay. But here's a bizarre scenario. So, we've got a porch that someday will be renovated. We don't really use it much. You can see we're storing, I don't know if you can see, we've stored a bunch of furniture out there. But let's just say that we can open those patio doors out to the back. Let's just say this were just like not even screened in. It's just a kind of a partially finished back patio. You can attach a sukkah to your house so that it is fully contiguous with the architecture of your domicile. Following? So you build your hut in such a way that you can keep the table inside, but you can still dwell in a sukkah. So the scenario is just that. The table's in the house. The sukkah, which goes immediately out back and is a halachically valid sukkah. So now you've got a person who's trying to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. His head, his body, he's sitting in the sukkah, but he's dining at a table that's in the house. Okay, you can visualize this bizarre scenario. Just strain your credulity a little bit to get there. All right. Here's what happens next. Beit Shammai deemed this sukkah invalid. Beit Shammai's like, that's no sukkah. Though I'm not sure that they're actually invalidating the sukkah. They may simply be invalidating whether or not the person who does so has fulfilled the mitzvah of being in a sukkah. That would be my read. The sukkah itself could be halachically valid. There are plenty of things which invalidate a sukkah, by the way. Like if you enclose the top with impermeable materials or wood, that's not a sukkah. It needs vegetation on the top that you can see through and the elements can penetrate. So I would object to the translation here and simply say, no, I think they're invalidating the act. Beit Hillel, however, deems it valid. Okay. Beit Hillel said to Beit Shammai, wasn't there an incident in which the elders of Beit Shammai and the elders of Beit Hillel went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChorani? Here's the Misa. Here's the Osei. So Hillel says, hey, long time ago, wasn't there a time when our elders and your elders all went to visit a certain Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChorani? And like Safaria does, you can click and find out who this gentleman is. He's over here. No description known. Okay. But that's what I would do if I were reading Safaria. And they found him sitting with his head and most of his body in the sukkah, but his table was in the house. In other words, hey, didn't this happen? And weren't our teachers all there? A Misa. We're going to teach by way of a thing that actually happened, an anecdote. Beit Shammai said to them, from there do you seek to adduce a proof? What kind of proof is this? Those visitors too said to him, if that was the manner in which you were accustomed to perform the mitzvah, you have never fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah in all your days. So Beit Shammai said, no, because even at that time, the visitors to the sukkah were instructed that this Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChorani was not fulfilling the mitzvah properly. The fact that they saw this happen does not constitute proof that it is halachically valid. And as you can see in the gloss, it is apparent from the phrasing of the Mishnah that when the sages of Beit Hillel related that the elders of Beit Shammai and the elders of Beit Hillel visited Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChorani, they mentioned the elders of Beit Shammai before their own elders. So the crux of the argument for the sake of the point that the Talmudic rabbis are trying to make here in this Misa has nothing to do with how you sit in a sukkah and fulfill the mitzvah. It has everything to do with the fact that when Beit Hillel quoted the episode from before in order to prove or adduce proof of their way of regarding the halacha, they mentioned Beit Shammai first. See? The elders of Beit Shammai and the elders of Beit Hillel. This is the quote. They say, your folks and ours. From that little detail, from the fact that Hillel had the courtesy of saying, your folks and ours went to visit this rabbi, that's the thing. It's the way in which they treat their colleagues that gives them the more compelling sway in whatever debate is being debated. It's very hard to catch that on your own. That's why the translation and the gloss are exceedingly helpful. Russell, would you like to chime in? And I assume at this point you can hear us, or you'd really be lost at this point. Oh, you vanished.
Yes.
There you are.
Yes. No, I did better than lip reading. Thank you very much. Is it really a coincidence that they use the example of the Half Sukkah to illustrate this point? Because it seems to me that the sitting half in the sukkah and half not in the sukkah is a metaphor for you're either in or you're out in this. There's no such, you can't be half Jewish and or Jewish part of the time, or Jewish when the food goes into your mouth, but not when it goes down the rest of the way.
That's
And
so
by-
lovely, by the way. I love that you are reading at a next level of depth, and I appreciate that.
Well, I mean, you flatter the word depth, but it seems to me that by naming the other opposing view first, you're basically inviting them into the sukkah. All of that way.
Gorgeously expressed. Speaks for itself. Thank you, Russell. Audrey.
Okay. Hopefully I'll be able to express this correctly, but this whole discussion about mentioning the other person first or the other, when I grew up, I was taught to say my friends and I instead of
Me and my friends.
Yeah, right. And I have noticed, starting with my own children, unfortunately, they always put themselves first, and it grates on me, but now everybody does it.
Yeah.
But it just came to me when we were having that discussion. That's really the way it should be anyway.
Beautiful. Amen. Amen. Like sometimes old manners are the best manners.
Right.
Okay. So that I think gives us, Mike Rahimi asks in the chat window, what happens when both sides of an argument are humble and show deference to each other, and both sides have equal merit and logic? If they are of equal logic and strength, why not say that either position is correct? Well, that's a really good point. And the answer is, I don't know. I guess the Talmud, at least in the cases of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, wants to make the larger point that it's not just what you say, and it's not just how you say it. It's both. It's what you say, it's how you say, it's with whom you say it. It's the deference that you give your colleague. I guess if both are equally meritorious on the merit of logic and deference to the other, then I don't know what will resolve the halacha, other than the possibility of what we learned the first week, which is majority rule. Take it to the academy and let the entire academy weigh in. But again, the Talmud seems satisfied at numerous junctures just to say, okay, we're moving on from this discussion without actually saying what the halacha is. This seems to be a larger folkloric excursus on why Hillel is prominent in Jewish law and Jewish norms, whereas and dominates, whereas Beit Shammai does not. So it seems to be specifically brought to elucidate why Beit Hillel ends up on all the college campuses, but nobody says I had Shabbat dinner at the Shammai house with my fraternity friends. Aaron.
Oh, hold on.
Yeah, you're good. You're on.
I guess for the sake of argument, could you take it a step further? Like, what if everyone's really deferential to each other and the majority still thinks the earth is flat? You know, which I think is, I think I struggle with a lot of these things, because the person who said the earth was round was right, but was one person facing a group of 3,000.
Yeah. Well, now you're getting to a very big philosophical, almost existential question for us, which is, what is the ultimate aim of this text and Jewish learning in general? For me, this is about the pursuit of truth. Or I should say, Judaism should not be inconsistent with the pursuit of truth. That's my Judaism. And I think that the reformers, for instance, in the era of the Enlightenment, the post-Enlightenment, late 18th, early 19th centuries, were very determined to make that their intellectual project, to make consistent the traditions and teachings of their faith with what could be deduced from reason, science, and rational inquiry. I'm not convinced that that is the project of the Talmudic rabbis, however.
I think that's what I struggle with, because I have a very scientifically oriented way of thinking.
Right.
As opposed to some of the lawyers in our group who are more used to.
Right. I mean, I will say that not for nothing, two thoughts. One, Judaism, although it venerates the Talmud, And although the Talmud becomes sort of the common ground from which all Jewish learning and practice future Jewish learning and practice will emerge, it is not the last word. And the fact that Judaism also, of all stripes, like whether you're an Ashkenazi Jew living in 21st century America, or you're a Sephardic Jew living in 18th century, Holland, venerates Maimonides, venerates the Rambam, because this was his great intellectual project, to harmonize philosophy, reason, science with the teachings of our faith. And he even says on numerous occasions that if what you learn from your biblical tradition, your Jewish tradition, is inconsistent with what you deduce from science and rational inquiry, then you don't understand your tradition correctly. Right? So if you read the Torah and think that a God of flesh, blood, limbs wants you to sacrifice animals so that God can smell the pleasing fragrance of burning animal flesh, you don't understand what the Bible is really trying to teach. And he will say, the reason that the Torah talks about animal sacrifice is because it was which is a completely irrational practice, he will say. It makes no scientific, it does not give evidence of a truth about the nature of the divine. If God is completely incorporeal, as Maimonides will say, has no body, cannot smell, does not care for human food, if that is true, then sacrifice in the biblical context makes no sense. So he argues, interestingly, that the reason the Torah includes a cult of sacrificing animals right after the Exodus from Egypt is because the poor, benighted Israelites who had known only Egyptian cultic practice needed it as a crutch. In other words, the Israelites couldn't understand an invisible, incorporeal God and needed animal sacrifice because that's what the Egyptians did. In other words, so yeah, the Torah includes this pagan practice for the benefit of the poor, intellectually benighted Israelites who just aren't at the level of rational ability that he would have said, we modern folks are, speaking from the vantage point of the 12th or 13th century of the Common Era. So, but again, my point is simply that Maimonides and the way in which tradition venerates his authority might be a reassuring sign that, the Talmud and its own irrational frame, at least with respect to our 21st century vantage point, is proof positive that Judaism moves on from the Talmud and seeks truth from other sources and seeks to find ways to harmonize them. As Maimonides, I think, most compellingly and eloquently put it, accept truth from whatever source it comes. And what that meant, it was a radical statement because it meant even if it contradicts what you think you know from the Torah.
Is that true of all of the sects of Judaism, or is it true?
Definitely not. Unfortunately, I think we are slipping into an intellectual morass of irrationality over the last 100 years. Or as Brian Wilson memorably sang on the Beach Boys' landmark album Pet Sounds from, I think, 1965 or 66, I guess I just wasn't made for these times. Me personally, like I'm a rabbi out of time in that I'm a devotee that everything we learn, or put most simply, we should never have to teach a child something they will later have to unlearn. What we practice Judaism must pass the rational smell test too. That's why I'm very proud to work at a congregation where reform is our middle name. But hey, it's not everyone's cup of tea. Okay, Mom and Dad, you're next, and then we're going to go back to the text, please.
So how to explain the global domination of a faith system that posits virgin birth and physical resurrection after death?
Well,
where do you go from there?
Right. I mean, look, I think that Karl Marx overstated the case in describing religion as an opiate of the masses. Nevertheless, a lot of people like their opiates, it would seem. A lot of people want religion to be the tradition that comforts them about the human condition, because of all the things that I've learned in my journey of Jewish learning, and of rational inquiry, which, as I've just said, I do not view to be inconsistent projects with each other, but that takes some work, is that truth hurts, baby. Truth is really uncomfortable, and a lot of people don't want to be made uncomfortable. A lot of people don't want to have their traditional assumptions challenged. And I don't mean to knock Christianity. In fact, I will use Christianity, or a very recent example, like from this week's news, to highlight the way in which Pope Francis's declaration that homosexuality should not be treated as a crime, and that the Catholic Church must work much, much harder in such countries where it is criminalized to embrace people in the LGBTQ community. Look at the pain that that statement inflicts on Catholic hardliners. But here we have a religious, leader of a very advanced age. I think he's 86, who days after the burial of Pope Benedict the 16th, is going out there and doing what I think he felt restrained from doing for his entire papacy up until now, which is actually trying to embrace a hurting community of Catholics, even in a way that challenges traditional notions around Catholic doctrine. So just so we're careful not to over-characterize one faith system over another, because I would argue that Haredi Judaism is no less irrational than those who subscribe in a literal way to virgin birth, for instance. Okay. Well, thank you for the soapbox. I'm gonna, as Judy points out, it is still regarded as a sin, not a crime. But by the way, that's consistent with how modern orthodoxy approaches homosexuality too. I'm so sorry that you're gay. I have all the love and compassion for you in the world. Unfortunately, I still can't sanction your marriage to another person of the same sex. In my view, enter Reform Judaism, which says everything we've learned about homosexuality suggests that it should not be viewed as a sin. It's your orientation. If God does not create in vain, and human beings are made in the image of God, then a person who, as it were, is born or comes out into the world or develops into a person whose sexual orientation is gay, how is that person not also made in the divine image? And how is that person's need for love and companionship any less valid than anyone else's? But that's a distinctly Reformed Jewish position, right? And that basically I'm saying I'm going to let what I've learned from science and psychology override Leviticus chapter 19 and 20. Okay, anyway, that's a real rabbit hole. Talmud goes there, just not today. All right, here we go. All right, so deference, right? Now the larger point is extracted from this. Lilamedcha, this teaches you, lilamedcha from lamad, which is the same root as Talmud. This teaches you, shekol hamashpil atzmo, anyone who humbles oneself, the Holy One, blessed be God, exalts that person. And anyone who exalts oneself, the Holy One, blessed be God, humbles that person. So this is a fun little mnemonic, right? A fun little easily memorized statement that if you arrogate yourself, you puff yourself up, God's gonna bring you down. And if you are self-effacing, God's gonna find a way to lift you up. Anyone who seeks greatness, greatness flees from him. And anyone who flees from greatness, greatness seeks him. So the path to true greatness, says the Talmud, is through the cultivation of humility. To arrogate oneself is to invite kind of divine putting you in your place. Would that this were so. Would that this were so. I can think of some people who have almost infinite self-regard, who continue to, seem not to suffer too much the consequences. I won't name names. All right. Anyone who attempts to force the moment. An interesting phrase. Kol hadochek et hasha'ah. Literally, dochek means to knock, to push, to force a moment. Sha'ah dochakto. The moment knocks him back. Somehow, aggressively, assertively seeking dominance, seeking prominence, seeking prestige, seeking to be right in an aggressive way, knocking, right, punching, hitting. The blowback will put you in your place. But anyone who yields to the moment, anyone who's sort of like softer, gentle, more forbearing, saying, you know what, I'm going to let things happen in their course. Sha'a omedet lo. Literally, the hour stands for him. Because that person's time will come. It's quite a lovely, you can see the part of the challenge and the beauty of studying Talmud is how varied the literature becomes, right? One minute, we're in the weeds about a person having a sukkah meal where the meal is actually still inside the house. The next minute, we have this beautiful, almost Zen koan-like teaching about humility and forcing an outcome as opposed to waiting patiently and just, you know, not aggressively asserting your dominance. It's quite a lovely little passage here, but there's more. All right, we move from here to a really interesting argument. And this was, in my view, what we really missed out on tackling last week and why I really immediately pivoted and said, no, we have to keep doing Eiruvin 13b. Hanu Rabbanan. Okay, so just so you're familiar with some common nomenclature, common vocabularies here. Tanu. Immediately think Mishnah, Tanaim, the early sages. It's an Aramaic word for teaching. It's the same as Shanu in Hebrew. Tanu, Shanu, they're the same. Tavs and shins are interchangeable from Hebrew to Aramaic. Shin in Hebrew becomes tav in Aramaic. Shalosh in Hebrew, which means the number 3, shalosh, in Aramaic is talat. 2 shins, shalosh, talat. It's the same word. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis of the Mishnaic period taught. And you can see they say here, this is a baraita, a word that I introduced us to at our first lesson a couple weeks ago, meaning an extra Mishnaic teaching. Think of it as Mishnah's cutting room floor. Comes from the period of the Mishnah, just for whatever reason, was not redacted into the Mishnah, but was preserved. So the rabbis taught for 2 years, and you can see shtei shanim, now we're back into Hebrew, for 2 years, umechatza, and a half. 2.5 years, nechleku, there's that word again from chelek, to apportion or cut, or to be divided along a certain issue. Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel. For 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were locked in a disagreement. This is, by the way, one of the most interesting philosophical debates recorded anywhere in Jewish literature. So we're going to have fun with this for the remainder of our class today. For 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. These say, now, how do you know which ones are being quoted? Just look at the order in which the antecedents appear. Beit Shammai first, Beit Hillel second. So these, meaning the first, the house of Shammai, says, it would have been preferable that man, meaning humankind, had man not been created than to have been created. So we're really in a kind of hypothetical argument here. Beit Shammai says, you know what? The world would be a better place if humanity had just never come around at all. If this is a shocking statement for you in Judaism, good, sit with your shock, but it's also, it's quintessentially Jewish. Even the fact that they're having this argument, would have been better for humankind to have been created or not created. Shammai says, not created. World would be a better place without us. But I want to highlight that the word for better here is also interesting. And I asked you to flag this word about 45 minutes ago. Halalu omrim. These, meaning Beit Shammai, said, Noach lo le'adam shelo nivra, yoter meshenivra. My translation, Noach. There's that word again. Noach, which means comfortable, comfort. It literally, it would have been comfortable for him, or more comfortable for Adam, humanity, a person, shelo nivra, not to have been created, yoter, more, misha nivra, than to have been created. If that seems tautological, then I think you're right. It would have been more comfortable for a person not to have been created than to, oh yeah, we wouldn't exist, we wouldn't know. That's comfortable. This is a master Jewish text about the human condition, because it presupposes that the dominant condition of being a person is to suffer. You need to understand that in order to move forward. So this is really a text about the meaning of human suffering and the nature of our existence. All right. V'halalu omrim, while the others, meaning Beit Hillel, say, Noach lo la'adam shenivra yoter mishelo nivra. No, on balance, it's actually better or more comfortable that people were created than had they not been created. As it says here, it is preferable. I don't love the word preferable because Noach literally means comfortable. For man to have been created than had he not been created. Ultimately, they were counted and concluded. Now that's an interesting word, they were counted. Nimnu v'gamru. What does that literally mean? They were counted. Does it mean they took a vote? How many rabbis of the house of Hillel? How many rabbis of the house of Shammai? Possibly. All the opinions were collected, because remember, these are attributed to academies, not individuals. It's not Hillel and Shammai, it's the academies that bear their names. So the Academy of Shammai says X, the Academy of Hillel says not X. They were counted, possibly the votes in the Academy, and it was concluded, Gamru from Gemara. This does not mean that this is a Gemara, it's just the same root word. This is the conclusion. Noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishenivra. This is a radical statement. The winning vote goes to Shammai. Shammai prevails, which we've learned. Shammai never prevails. But this is one of the three rare exceptions in all of Halacha where Shammai prevails. And interestingly, it's not really a Halacha, is it? There's no practical Jewish law to be practiced here. It's merely a philosophical point of difference between the two academies. It is still noteworthy, however, that Shammai's opinion prevails. He says ultimately it would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. But again, even when he wins, Shammai doesn't get the last word in Jewish tradition. A final word is added, and it's not clear whether this is a later rabbinic commentary or something that the House of Hillel added to the dialogue. But what gets recorded here is itself noteworthy. Achshav shenivra. Achshav is a Hebrew word. Any of you modern Hebrew speakers know achshav. It means now. Achshav shenivra. But now that he has been created, in other words, why are we arguing about whether it would be better for people to have been created or not created? We're here. It's moot. It's completely pointless to debate this. Now that we are here, yifash peish b'ma'asav. There's that word ma'aseh again, Misa. Let him examine his deeds. Let him examine, or let them examine their deeds. As they translate here, he should examine his actions. I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to give you the translation. Ve'amrila, or some say, or it is also said, yimashmesh b'ma'asav. Not examine his deeds, but really kind of like, what did they translate it here? They say, scrutinize his actions. And the traditional interpretation is, one means let him examine the deeds he has already committed or done. The other means let him deeply contemplate what he is about to do. I am not sure the difference is all that meaningful. I think what is meaningful is that Shammai doesn't get the last word. Okay, so in a hypothetical world, it would have been better or certainly more comfortable for humanity never to have been created. Implied, because we suffer. Because to be human is to endure suffering. But now that we're here, even if in a hypothetical world it would have been better without us, or it certainly would have been easier for us had we not been here. I know that sounds, well, it's kind of like it's a self-negating statement, tautological statement. Now that we're here, the goal is that we think deeply about what we've done and or contemplate deeply how we are to act in this world. That's the ultimate meaning, which is really a statement against, I think, nihilism. So even though Beit Shammai prevails, his view is by definition nihilistic. It would have been better not to have been created is a blanket statement that defines nihilism as a philosophy. The final statement is, and again, these are anachronistic terms, of course, the rabbis of the ancient times did not know from nihilism, but the concluding statement is the definition of existentialism. The meaning of your life is how you define it through your deeds. Your life will mean the meaning you assign to it by the way you live. So we actually have a master debate about nihilism and existentialism, even though those terms are anachronistic in the context of Talmud. Okay, so now your thoughts, comments, questions, Russell, Steve, Barbara, in that order.
Thank you. It's fascinating to me that these rabbis would debate an issue that seems to say that God made a mistake. You know, did God make a mistake in creating us? And then I remind myself that on each day of creation, God saw it was good. He didn't see that it was the best, but it was good. It seems to me that the final statement is really telling us that having been the objects of creation, we are now invited to complete God's creation through our deeds, through adherence to Torah. And that is how I read Shammai's statement. Why Shammai's statement is not, it's true, but it's not good enough.
Beautiful. Yeah, and inviting us, Russell, as you do, we should appreciate how theologically daring the Talmud can be. It's one of the things that I like most and have never lost my capacity for surprise, even shock, at some of the statements the Talmud makes and the logical conclusions that would follow from them. Just meditate on this passage. Did the Talmud really just say something that appears as if God's creation itself warrants being challenged? It's an astonishing thing. What other religious traditions go there? I don't know. Again, I try to teach Judaism on its own merit and not comparatively. But boy, this is really out there. Okay, Steve, you're next, and then Barbara will hear from you, please.
So I love what was just said, but I've been thinking about this concept of debating whether man should have been created differently, not whether God made a mistake, but whether humankind was somehow created by a God, or instead whether humankind has the ability to control themselves, and you know the idea that whether or not it happened, we control our actions is the ultimate conclusion, which means to say, I mean, I don't think I've expressed the first part right, but basically, self-determination exists regardless.
Beautiful. And let me add that I think that one could argue that the use of the passive voice here is very cleverly and deliberately deployed, so that God does skate through without culpability for this philosophical conundrum being raised. And it does not directly mention God. It said was created. It does not say, would it have been better that God created humanity or not have created humanity? It says was created, nivra, the passive voice. So I think that is an artful, clever way that the ambiguity in the text, is this about God or is it not about God, remains open and ambiguous. Barbara.
Basically, I was thinking that creation is not about whether we exist. It's about whether there was a creation point relative to us.
Beautiful, Steve. And now again, accepting that, well, it's a fact on the ground. So now what are you going to do? I mean, that's Judaism. Enough debating about the meaning of creation. It's like, we're here. We've got lives to live. How are we going to live them? Barbara, please.
I'm caught on the word lemashmesh. Lemashmesh means to feel.
Yes. To
Doesn't it?
palpate. To
Right.
palpate. And in Hebrew, mamash is
Yes.
the word that means really, like something is tangible. It's mamash. So yes, and that's why I love that. Like, palpate your deeds, whatever that may mean.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a beautiful. Thank you. It's so nice having a Hebrew teacher in our midst who can help us go deeper. But again, these words. One says yifashpesh ma'asav. One says yimashmesh ma'asav. Potato, maybe, or maybe
I know,
not.
but just where is that in the context? I mean, to feel. I mean, that doesn't go with the context of what they're talking about.
Right, or to feel out your deeds. Maybe another way of putting it. It leaves it. Look. It's poetry more than it is prose at this point. I think it's inviting the reader to contribute to the meaning. Even the fact that the rabbis it probably was just a debate over which verb was being remembered here. Remember, this is an oral tradition. So from the back row of the academy, yifashpesh and yimashmesh sound a whole lot alike. So they both get remembered. And they both have these different nuances, these slightly different valences. Yifashpesh, more intellectual contemplation, yimashmesh, palpating or touching.
Right.
But I just love that. I'm in love with words and linguistics anyway. So the fact that both of these verbs are recorded is an invitation to the reader to do exactly what we're doing today and really think about what is being conveyed through those two verbs. Lovely. Thank you, Barbara. Erin, another comment, please.
I mean, I could be totally off base here, but I also take it this whole idea that it would have been better if we hadn't been created, not just for us, but the world around us, like a reflection on not just our suffering, but how we are actually making our world better or not.
I have, in fact, used this teaching in a class about the relationship between humanity and the creation on environmental responsibility. It works very well in that context. It doesn't have all the answers. It just invites us into a deeper conversation. And, who can say what a text means? I subscribe to the view that texts mean a combination of things. They mean what the author intended, which is often completely unavailable to us. And even authors who are living sometimes refuse to disclose what they meant. Bob Dylan is a famous example. Every time he's been pressed on, well, what did you mean when you said or you sang or you wrote? He'll duck the question, because many artists don't want to, just because they don't want to restrict the meaning of what is written or communicated in language to just what was in their minds at the time they wrote it. So if you want to take a Jewish text like this and utilize it in a conversation about what is the proper responsibility or relationship between humanity and the world, this text is a great window through which to have that conversation. Lovely. Okay, so finishing up for today, I just want to show you something that should amuse you and educate you at the same time, which is, so what happens next in the Talmud? Like, we have gone on a journey that's more like this, but at least for the last several, what we call sugyot. A sugya is an Aramaic word that means a subject. So you'll sometimes hear me say, what is the meaning of this sugya? Or what is this sugya about? Sugya just means a section of Talmud. It doesn't have a stipulated length or boundary. It can be big, it can be small. It generally means one topic of conversation is a sugya. It doesn't always correspond to a particular page. It can extend over multiple pages or across an A, B section of Talmud. But in this sugya, which is all about the debates between Hillel and Shammai, not just what they argued, but how, and the meaning of that, we've kind of a crescendo. We've gone from pedantic and almost silly concerns like dining in a sukkah where your head, or dining outside, you're in a sukkah and the meal is in the house and like, who cares, to the nature of existence and humanity's role in existence and our like the most elevated and abstract of concepts, still framed along Hillel and Shammai. We've been doing that now. We've been doing this for the last 2 weeks, right? It took us 2 90-minute sessions with some opening lecture and framework, but still, we've spent hours now on a single page of Talmud, which is what Talmud study is, by the way. That's why Daf Yomi, the practice of learning a page a day, is still a significant commitment. If you've learned a whole page of Talmud, you should pat yourselves on the back. That's a big deal. But remember that we're in Tractate Eiruvin, which nominally is about Sabbath boundaries. So amuse and educate yourselves with the following passage. All right, so we finished this about the big philosophical debate. But now the next Mishnah arrives. And you can see that Safaria helps us by doing what the Talmud itself does. It puts the word matani, which means it was taught in the Mishnah. That's the word you need to know that we're back into Mishnah, the core stratum of the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud is the Mishnah. Matani, hakora she'amru rachba kedei lekabel ariach. A crossbeam, which the sages stated may be used to render an alleyway fit for one to carry within it, must be wide enough to receive and hold a small brick. And this small brick is half a large brick, which measures 3 handbreadths, i.e. a handbreadth and a half. It is sufficient that the crossbeam will be a handbreadth in width, not a handbreadth and a half, enough to hold a small brick across its width. That's actually what Tractate Eiruvin was originally about. And everything we've just done is a rabbit hole. And without any warning, the Talmud is like, oh, right. What were we talking about? The meaning of life, death, the universe, and everything? No, we're actually talking about how wide an alleyway can be so that you can carry a crossbeam of 1.5, or perhaps it is 3 bricks side by side. Amuse and educate, right? This too is how the Talmud functions. And just so you can see what happens here, if you really want to know about halachic restrictions on how wide an alleyway can be, all of this. What kind of a crossbeam? What if it is curved? What do we mean by a handbreadth? Oh, we're still going, by the way. What about the durability of the crossbeam that holds these bricks? What about one placing a crossbeam over the entrance of an alleyway, draping a mat over it and raising the lower end of the mat 3 handbreadths from the ground, where there is neither a crossbeam here nor there is a partition here to render the alleyway fit for one to carry within it? I have no freaking idea what is actually being communicated here. Right? I'm sorry, like this is where I get lost. And this is why I'm much better with lore than law in Judaism, because I want to talk about Eliezer, I want to talk about Shammai and Hillel and Eliezer in the academy, but that's not Talmud. Talmud is the microscopic, the minutia around the width and shape and durability and material components of a crossbeam that is used to determine what an acceptable alleyway is under Jewish law. Just so you understand where this all fits in. That's the bigger picture. Steve.
Yeah, maybe it's just to show that not everything's a debate.
Well, everything is a debate. And the thing is, it's actually a debate now. We're not going to be debating the meaning of our existence. We're back to debating what can a crossbeam be made. When we talk about a crossbeam, what do we mean by a crossbeam? And when we talk about a handbreadth, what do we mean by a handbreadth? And when we talk about a brick, what is the brick made of? Is it wood? Is it metal? Is it vegetable? I mean, it's
concrete practice.
Literally. Good pun. Michelle.
I think that my bottom line here is that it's not true that anything goes.
Say more.
Well, we can debate everything and we can see 2 sides or 3 sides or however many positions. And then one might say, oh, well, in that case, what difference does it make? We've been told that it isn't just up to God. It is how things are, and it's interpreted in each generation and all of that. And so we could take the logical conclusion to the far end conclusion that, well, it just doesn't matter, and it's whatever
if
people
anything
think
goes.
is good. But the fact is it always comes back to something, I think, that is cited. And if I recall correctly, you can use a baraita to prove a point, but if you're trying to overrule something in the Talmud, the baraita doesn't count. And if you can tie it back, we've talked about this before, if you can tie it back to a biblical quote, you have an even stronger position. So you, in fact, it isn't everything goes.
Right.
And that is part of what, maybe not whether we were created, but why we were created.
Beautiful. Erin, maybe a last word before I wrap us up today.
I guess I just go back to why we would go from having such a meaningful conversation about the existence of humanity to why did the rabbis think that was worth time debating?
I'll give you one possible answer, because I think the assumption should be that the rabbis believed that this was equally valuable, equally, if not more. And again, I said last week, don't be fooled by the way in which I'm teaching Talmud to think that it's all the deep philosophical stuff. And that's why the debate over the Sukkah is actually not irrelevant, not immaterial to the conversation. It is the conversation, as is the crossbeam, which goes on and on and on and on and on. I believe that what is on display here is the, you know anything about, do any of your kids play Minecraft? Okay. I'll bet you your son, right? It tends to be gendered, but maybe girls too.
You're probably right.
Okay. Minecraft is a video game that has taken the world by storm, and it's actually a really cool game because it's not primarily about shooting and killing and war. It's about world building. World building is a term that is common in the video game creation universe, as well as in, for instance, sci-fi. Sci-fi authors are often praised in critical reviews for their ability to build worlds. I think that we should look at the Talmud as an effort in world building that is itself a sustained, centuries-long project that creates a new architecture for Jewish living in a world where the temple has been destroyed. Because everything about the Talmud suggests that the Mishnah first and the Talmud after it is an effort in, like, forgive me for another anachronistic term here, but the cloud, to build a world that was torn out from under the Jewish people by violence. That everything about the Talmud is a response to the greatest trauma of our civilization as Jewish people up until then. Obviously, one could argue that the Shoah is a trauma of greater or at least equal magnitude, but we're not there, not even close chronologically. The trauma of seeing their temple destroyed, their priesthood decapitated, their sovereignty ripped out from under them, their people enslaved or killed en masse, their home being conquered, their people being driven out from their homeland, was a trauma from which every writing subsequent to these events, is a response. And the attention that is given to the dimensions of alleyways for the purpose of observing the restrictions and permissions around what can be carried and how far can you go within your community on foot on the Sabbath, is a sustained effort at rebuilding a world in the cloud that no longer exists in real space. Barbara, I'm going to let you have one more comment, and then I think we should wrap up.
Okay. What you just said to me comes to mind what the rabbis put into the Talmud about Hanukkah. And
Yes.
And it's because it would be in some place that was not, they weren't under their own power. It's actually detrimental and life-threatening to celebrate a military victory.
That's right. We are moving in the Talmud maybe not systematically, But you look at it from a zoomed out lens and you say, what is this book trying to do? It's trying to build a world that responds to the trauma of the destruction of temple, sovereignty, and land. And that overhauled the entire faith. You know, obviously, as a Reformed Jew, as a rabbinical Jew, I'm glad we don't sacrifice animals in a temple with a priesthood being the dominant leaders of the Jewish community. But that's not authentic to the experience of the people who lived through it and their descendants. And so a holiday that would continue to glorify a military insurrection against an empire is not just, you know, irrelevant religiously or spiritually for the rabbis of the Talmud, it's potentially seditious and dangerous for them. Right? You don't want to have a holiday that glorifies taking up arms against the power. It's a bad idea. So thank you. Can't wait to learn with you again next week.
Okay. I just
Thanks,
wanted to
everyone.
ask it. Okay.
I got to sign off as much as I
Well,
love
look about John. Beautifully
Take
done.
care.
Thank you.
Or next week. Okay. Bye-bye, my friends.
Menorah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Too
you.
much
everyone.
about.
Yes, good. Bye.